The conference room on the 41st floor of Hale Capital Technologies had gone so quiet that the only sound was the faint hum of the air system overhead. CEO Catherine Hale stood at the head of the table, both palms flat against the polished surface, her eyes fixed on the data dashboard projected across the wall. The numbers had changed. The model that her most senior engineers had been wrestling with for 72 straight hours, the algorithm that had ground a $1.2 billion acquisition to a complete standstill, was showing different output, clean output, correct output. She stared at it for a long moment, then turned to the room. "Who solved this?" she asked. Her voice was low and precise, the same voice she used when she already suspected she was not going to like the answer. No one spoke. The 12 engineers, seated around the table, glanced at each other, then back at the screen. Then, from the doorway at the far end of the room, almost hidden behind the doorframe, there was a small sound, a shuffle, and when Catherine turned to look, she saw a little girl, no older than 6, standing with both hands wrapped around a worn stuffed rabbit. The child did not speak. She simply raised one small arm and pointed not at the engineers, not at the screen, but at the man standing in the far corner of the room with a mop in his hands. If you have ever been the most capable person in a room where no one knew your name, then you already understand what this story is about. The New York headquarters of Hale Capital Technologies occupied 6 floors of a glass tower near the Hudson River, and its reputation was built on 3 things: speed, precision, and the willingness to make decisions that other firms were too cautious to touch. Catherine Hale had inherited the firm from her father at 29 and had spent 5 years reshaping it into something harder, leaner, and more aggressive than it had ever been under his watch. She was 34 now, and the word most commonly used to describe her inside the company was cold. She evaluated information the way a surgeon evaluated tissue. Dispassionately, efficiently, without sentiment. She did not dislike people. She simply found most of them less useful than they believed themselves to be. The acquisition she was currently managing was the largest deal the firm had attempted since her tenure began. The target was a mid-size fintech company with a proprietary risk pricing engine that, if integrated properly into Hale Capital's existing infrastructure, would allow the firm to move into fixed-income derivatives at a scale that its competitors could not match. The deal had taken 14 months to structure. The closing was scheduled in 4 days. Everything was in place except for the algorithm. The algorithm was called ARIA. It stood for Adaptive Risk Intelligence Architecture. And under normal conditions, it was the kind of system that made rivals nervous. It modeled asset risk across 19 variables simultaneously, self-corrected in real time, and had a documented error rate of less than 0.3% across 4 years of live deployment. But 2 weeks ago, without any apparent trigger, ARIA had begun producing distorted valuations, not dramatically wrong, just subtly, persistently wrong in a way that compounded across the model until the output was effectively useless. Catherine's lead engineer, a 38-year-old named Derek Simmons, had assembled a team of 7 specialists and had been working the problem around the clock. They had tried rollbacks to 3 previous stable versions. They had run diagnostic patches against every function in the codebase. They had rebuilt 2 of the core modules from scratch. Nothing held. The man in the corner of that conference room was named Nathaniel Brooks. He was 37 years old, broad-shouldered, with a quiet face that had developed a few lines around the eyes in the last several years, in ways that had nothing to do with laughter. He wore a gray uniform with the building services logo on the chest pocket, and he worked the night shift, 5 days a week. He was not the kind of man people looked at twice. That was, in fact, something he had come to rely on. His daughter's name was Luna. She was 6 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. She carried a stuffed rabbit named Arthur everywhere she went. Arthur was missing one eye and had a fraying seam along his left ear, and Luna would not hear of replacing him. On the days when Nathaniel had no one to watch her and the school was closed, he brought her to work with him. The building's overnight custodial supervisor, a heavy-set woman named Gloria, had quietly agreed to look the other way as long as Luna stayed near the service hallway and did not touch anything. Luna was very good at not touching things. What she was not particularly good at was staying quiet when she was curious, and she was almost always curious. The rumor about Nathaniel, the one that circulated occasionally among the older staff in hushed tones, and with the casual cruelty of people who have nothing at stake, was that he had once been an engineer, a good one, supposedly, but that there had been a project something years ago, at a different firm, and that the project had failed badly, and that the failure had been pinned on him, and that he had been blacklisted from the industry as a result. Most people treated this story the way they treated most rumors, as entertainment, not as fact. Derek Simmons, who had heard the rumor from a receptionist during his 3rd month at the company, had laughed and said that anyone with real talent wouldn't be mopping floors for $12 an hour. No one had disagreed with him. The morning of the 3rd day after Aria began producing corrupted output, Catherine called the full engineering team into the main conference room at 7 a.m. and told them with complete calm that the board had given her 48 hours. If the algorithm was not functioning correctly by Friday morning, the acquisition would collapse. The other party had a competing offer on the table. They would not wait. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She laid out the situation and then asked Derek to walk her through the team's current diagnostic framework. Derek had dark circles under his eyes and the slightly desperate look of a man who had stopped trusting his own conclusions. He walked her through 4 different approaches they had tried, and why each one had failed to produce a lasting fix. The model kept reverting. The errors were not random, they were patterned. But the pattern did not correspond to any known class of machine learning failure that any of them had encountered before. After 40 minutes, a junior engineer named Paul suggested that they could temporarily mask the corrupted outputs with synthetic data until the deal closed and then address the root issue afterward. Catherine looked at him for a moment without expression. "No," she said. She did not elaborate. She simply gathered her materials and left. What no one in that room had noticed, because no one in that room was paying attention to the hallway, was that the service door at the back of the conference floor had been propped open by a cleaning cart, and that a small girl with a stuffed rabbit had been sitting on the floor near the cart for the last 20 minutes, listening. It started 3 mornings after the diagnostic sessions began. The overnight engineering team, a rotating pair of engineers who came in at midnight to run tests and log results, began arriving to find that certain segments of Aria's output looked cleaner than they had the night before. Not fixed. Just less broken. The corrupted sections would contract slightly, as if something had been nudged back into alignment. By the time the day team arrived and began their own testing, the improvement would often vanish again under the weight of the full model running at load. But the logs preserved it. And the logs were showing something else. Someone had been accessing the system between 2 and 4 in the morning. Derek Simmons discovered this on a Wednesday, reviewing the access logs during a break at 2 in the afternoon. The timestamps were consistent, not every night, but most nights over the preceding 2 weeks. The access came from a terminal in the server maintenance corridor on the 39th floor, a room that required a building keycard to enter but not an engineering credential. Derek brought the logs to Catherine's assistant, who brought them to Catherine. Catherine reviewed them without comment, then asked facilities management for the keycard access records for that corridor. The records showed one name, Nathaniel Brooks. Derek Simmons laughed when he was told. It was a short, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh that is meant to close a subject. "He's a janitor," Derek said. "He probably wandered in there by mistake. Maybe he was looking for a supply closet." The head of IT security agreed this was the most likely explanation. No one followed up. The next morning, the logs showed another overnight access event, and the output segments that had been accessed were, again, slightly cleaner than they had been the night before. One of the mid-level managers, a man named Craig who had been with the company for 9 years and had a particular talent for saying the wrong thing at the right volume, passed Nathaniel in the hallway that Thursday afternoon and said to the colleague walking beside him loudly enough to be heard that he'd heard Nathaniel was somehow involved in the algorithm investigation. Craig's colleague asked if that was serious. Craig smiled and said, "The man doesn't know how to use a spreadsheet. I had to show him how to print a document last month." They both laughed. Nathaniel kept walking. He did not change his pace or his expression, but his jaw tightened for just a moment before it released. That evening, after Luna had fallen asleep on the folded blanket he kept in the back of the cleaning cart, Nathaniel sat in the dim light of the server maintenance corridor and pulled up Aria's diagnostic interface on the terminal. He had been doing this for 2 weeks now, and he understood the problem clearly enough at this point that the understanding had stopped being satisfying and had simply become a weight. The thing that no one on Derek's team had found, the thing they kept missing because they were looking at it the wrong way, was not a bug. It was not a flaw in the code. The code was almost perfectly written. The problem was a logical error in the model's foundational assumption structure, specifically in the way the machine learning layer had been trained to weight volatility signals during periods of asymmetric liquidity. Someone, whoever had originally built ARIA, had used a training dataset that contained a systematic blind spot. Under normal market conditions, that blind spot didn't matter, but the market conditions of the last 3 months had been anything but normal. And the model was now applying weights that had been learned from a context that no longer existed. You couldn't fix it with a patch. You had to retrain the layer, but you couldn't retrain the layer without first understanding which of the 19 input variables had been contaminated by the flawed weighting, and identifying those variables required a kind of lateral analysis that was not part of any standard debugging protocol. You had to look at the model the way you might look at a person who was lying, not at what they were saying, but at the pattern of what they were consistently not saying. Nathaniel had been working through the variables methodically, 1 or 2 each night. He did not document his work. He did not leave notes. He simply made the adjustments he could make without triggering the system's automated rollback protocols, logged out, and went back to his cart. Luna had asked him, on a Tuesday night 2 weeks in, why the people upstairs couldn't fix the thing he was fixing. She had been eating crackers from a small bag and watching him work, the way she often did, with the particular patience of a child who understood that her father was doing something real. Nathaniel had thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because they're not looking long enough," he said. Luna considered this. "How long is long enough? Until you stop seeing what you expected to see." She had nodded as if this made complete sense to her, then offered him a cracker, which he accepted. On Thursday night, 2 days before the acquisition deadline, Catherine Hale did not go home. She had a routine when a deal was in danger. She stayed. Not to work, necessarily, but to be present. She had learned years ago that her own proximity to a problem sometimes changed how her mind approached it. The way that sleeping in an airport when a flight was delayed somehow made the waiting more productive. She sent her assistant home at 10. She changed into the spare clothes she kept in her office closet. She made coffee in the executive kitchen on the 42nd floor, and then, because she had already reviewed every report 3 times and there was nothing new to review, she began walking. She took the stairs down. She walked through the 39th floor at 11:45, past the darkened glass offices, past the server rooms and the utility corridors, mostly just to move. The corridor that led to the maintenance terminal was partially lit, the overhead panels on a timer, and she almost walked past it. But the door was cracked open, and there was light inside. Catherine pushed the door open slowly. Nathaniel was seated at the terminal with his back to her, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, a legal pad covered in handwritten notation on the desk beside the keyboard. Luna was asleep on the folded blanket in the corner, Arthur tucked under one arm. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and, faintly, like the crackers in the open bag near the child's feet. Catherine stood in the doorway for several seconds before Nathaniel registered the change in the light and turned. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You've been accessing this terminal," Catherine said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "You're not authorized for this system." "I know. What are you doing to it?" He turned back to the screen. "Fixing it." Catherine walked into the room. She looked at the screen, then at the legal pad. The handwriting was dense equations, variable notations, marginal comments written in a shorthand that looked, to her eye, like the kind of documentation a serious engineer would produce for their own reference, rather than for anyone else to read. She picked up the legal pad. She was not an engineer. Her background was in financial mathematics and institutional strategy. But she understood enough to recognize that what she was looking at was not the work of someone who had stumbled onto a terminal by accident. "Explain this," she said. She set the pad back down in front of him. Nathaniel looked at the pad, then at her. "You wouldn't believe me if I explained it without demonstrating it," he said. "True." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to the terminal and began pulling up a sequence of diagnostic displays, not the output screens the engineers had been working from, but the underlying layer architecture, the training data schema, the variable weighting matrices. He worked through them quickly and without hesitation, pulling one window alongside another, drawing connections that Catherine could see even if she could not entirely follow the logic. "Your engineers are working on the wrong level," he said. He did not say this with contempt. He said it the way you state a fact about weather. The code is fine. The architecture is fine. The problem is in how the model was taught to think. It learned the wrong lesson, and it's been applying that lesson ever since. Every patch they run is correcting the symptoms while the cause keeps producing new ones. Catherine studied the screen. Can you fix it by Friday morning? Nathaniel looked at the clock on the wall. It was 5 minutes past midnight. I've been fixing it for 2 weeks, he said. I have 4 variables left. She stood there for a long moment, watching him work. Luna made a small sound in her sleep and shifted, pulling Arthur tighter. Catherine looked at the child, and then looked away. Finish it, Catherine said. She left without another word. At 6:47 on Friday morning, the ARIA system came online at full capacity and ran its first complete valuation cycle since the corruption had begun. The output was clean. Every variable was within normal range. Derek Simmons was the first engineer in the office, and he stared at his monitor for almost a full minute before calling the rest of the team. Catherine arrived at 7:15. She already knew she had been monitoring the terminal access logs from her phone since 4 a.m., watching the last variables fall into place. She walked into the main conference room, where Derek and 6 of his engineers were standing around the central display in various states of exhausted relief, and she said the 4 words that had been forming in her since the night before. Who solved this? She asked. The room went quiet. The engineers looked at each other. Derek cleared his throat and said he was still reviewing the overnight logs to understand what had happened. A junior engineer said she had been running confirmation tests all morning, and the fix appeared to be complete and permanent. No one said a name. Catherine waited, and then, from the doorway at the far end of the room, the service entrance that opened onto the cleaning corridor, came the small sound of a child's sneaker on the floor. Luna appeared in the doorway, Arthur under her arm, looking at the room with the calm, appraising gaze of someone who has been watching adults for a long time and has learned not to be impressed by them. She looked at Catherine. She looked at the engineers. Then she turned and pointed at the man standing behind her in the corridor with a mop in his hands. For a moment, the room did the thing that rooms sometimes do when the thing that was expected turns out to be not the thing at all. There was a small, involuntary laugh from somewhere near the middle of the table. Someone near the window made a sound that was not quite words. Craig, who had arrived early and was standing near the coffee station, pressed his lips together in the particular way of a person who has just made a bet and felt it go wrong. Catherine walked to the doorway. She looked at Nathaniel. He did not look away. Come in, she said. He came in. Luna followed him and took a seat near the wall, opened a small sketchbook she had been carrying, and began to draw. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not something any of the engineers who were present that morning would describe the same way twice, but all of them would remember it. Nathaniel stood at the head of the conference table still in his gray uniform and walked through the problem with the kind of quiet, precise clarity that comes not from wanting to impress anyone, but from knowing something well enough that explanation is simply the natural extension of understanding. He began with the training data. He pulled up the variable weighting matrices from ARIA's original development phase and pointed to the specific correlation structure that had created the blind spot. He explained why the error was invisible under normal conditions and why it became destructive under asymmetric liquidity, and as he spoke, he did not simplify, did not reach for metaphors, did not soften any of the technical language. He spoke to the room as if everyone in it was capable of following him. Some of them were not. Derek Simmons, who had 12 years of machine learning engineering behind him and had been working this specific problem for 72 hours, found himself reaching the edges of his comprehension at roughly the halfway point. He understood the conclusion. He could not fully reconstruct the path Nathaniel had taken to reach it. Walk me through the variable isolation step again, Derek said. He kept his voice even, but there was something in it, a tension, a friction that the room could hear. Nathaniel turned from the display and looked at him. Which part? The part where you identified variable 11 as the anchor for the contamination. I don't follow how you got there without running a full sensitivity analysis. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. I didn't run a sensitivity analysis, he said. I looked at what the model kept getting right and worked backward from the exceptions. Derek opened his mouth and then closed it. Nathaniel said, quietly and without emphasis, You've been trying to fix the symptoms. You haven't been looking for the cause. The room was absolutely still. Catherine was standing near the window, watching. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes were moving from Nathaniel to the display to Derek and back, calculating something that had nothing to do with the algorithm. Catherine spent the rest of Friday managing the acquisition close, which proceeded without incident. Aria ran 17 valuation cycles across the afternoon and produced clean output on all 17. The deal was confirmed at 4:20 in the afternoon. The board called it a success. Catherine thanked her team in the brief, efficient way she had of expressing things that did not require elaboration. She signed the closing documents and returned 2 calls she had been deferring all week and answered a congratulatory message from the board chair with 4 sentences. She did all of these things the way she always did them, efficiently and without distraction. But she was aware, underneath the motion, of something that had not been there before the previous night. She kept returning to the image of a man sitting alone in a dim corridor at midnight, working on a problem that no one had asked him to solve, and that no one in the building believed he was capable of solving. She kept returning to the legal pad covered in handwriting that was neater than most engineers' code. She kept returning to a child asleep on a folded blanket, with a rabbit tucked under her arm, and to the particular quality of stillness in that room, the sense that what she had walked into was not a violation of protocol, but something else entirely. Something that looked, if she was honest with herself, a lot like integrity. But she did not go home when the others left. She sat at her desk and opened the file she had asked HR to pull that morning. Nathaniel Brooks. Employment history. Professional record. Everything the company had on him, which was not much. He had applied for the custodial position with a minimal resume and had given no professional references and had listed, in the prior experience section, only a single line. General maintenance. Various clients. Catherine had seen this kind of deliberate erasure before. It was the resume of someone who had decided that invisibility was safer than explanation. She had hired him because the position needed filling quickly, and because Gloria in building services had vouched for him in the particular way that people who work closely with someone vouch for them, not with words about character but with words about reliability. He shows up. He doesn't cause problems. He's good with the equipment. These had seemed like sufficient recommendations for a custodial hire. Catherine was now aware, in a way that was not entirely comfortable, of how much she had allowed that framing to shape everything that came after. But she had also called 2 people she trusted at other firms, and by early evening she had a clearer picture. Nathaniel had been a machine learning engineer at a firm called Vantage Systems, where he had worked for 6 years, and by all credible accounts had been one of the most talented people in the building. 5 years ago, Vantage had launched a product that failed publicly and expensively. The failure had been attributed, in the official post-mortem, to an architectural error made by the lead engineer. That engineer had been Nathaniel. He had been terminated, and the termination had been accompanied by a quiet but effective effort on the part of Vantage's senior management to ensure that no firm in the industry would hire him in a technical capacity. Catherine pulled the original post-mortem document. It had not been hard to find. These things rarely disappeared entirely. They just got buried. She read it carefully, and then she read it again, and then she sat for a long time looking at the window. The error described in the post-mortem was not the error that had caused the product to fail. She could see that now. With Nathaniel's methodology fresh in her mind, the actual failure had been a market timing problem, an external factor that no engineer could have prevented. The architectural issue described in the report existed, but it was minor and had been present in the model for years without consequence. Someone had needed a name to attach to the failure, and Nathaniel's name had been the most convenient one available. She called him on Saturday morning. He answered on the 3rd ring. "I looked into your history," she said, without preamble. There was a pause. "Okay," he said. "You were set up." Another pause. Longer. "I know," he said. "I'd like you to come back to this company. Not in building services. As chief AI architect. You'd have full authority over ARIA and all related systems. Compensation, commensurate with the role. Benefits, equity, whatever you need." The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that has weight to it. "No," Nathaniel said. Catherine had not expected that. She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "Can I ask why?" He took a breath. "Because I spent 3 years in places like yours," he said, "and what those places taught my daughter by how they treated me. by what she saw and heard and understood even when I thought she wasn't paying attention, was that her father was worthless. I'm not going back somewhere that confirms that. Catherine did not respond immediately. She was not a woman who was often without words, and the feeling of not having them was uncomfortable in a way she noticed but did not quite know what to do with. Then what would you need? She said finally. Not from the company. From me. It was a different question. They both heard the difference. On Monday morning, Catherine called an all-hands meeting. The entire company, all 312 employees across the New York office, assembled in the building's main atrium at 9 a.m. Catherine stood at the front without notes. She described what had happened over the previous 2 weeks. She described the algorithm failure and the failed attempts to fix it and the way the problem had ultimately been solved. She named Nathaniel Brooks, and she described, clearly and without softening, the role he had played. Then she described what she had discovered about his professional history, the circumstances of his termination from Vantage Systems, the evidence that the blame assigned to him had not been warranted, the years he had spent in custodial work, while the industry that had trained him refused to let him back in. She paused. I also want to address something specific, she said. Several members of this staff, over the past 2 weeks, made comments about Mr. Brooks that were dismissive, derogatory, and wrong. Those comments were made in front of colleagues, in hallways and meeting rooms, and they went unchallenged because of an assumption about what a person in a certain role must be worth. That assumption was wrong, and the culture that produces that assumption, the reflex to measure a person's intelligence by their job title, is not something I'm willing to tolerate in this building. Craig, standing near the back, had gone very still. Effective today, Catherine continued, I'm creating a new position. Senior AI Strategy Advisor. The person in that role will work directly with our engineering division on the development and maintenance of all AI systems. The schedule is flexible. The position is permanent. She looked toward the side of the atrium, where Nathaniel was standing in a clean set of clothes, dark slacks, a simple blue button-down with Luna beside him, still holding Arthur. I've also accepted a resignation this morning, Catherine said, which I won't comment on further. She did not look at Craig when she said it. She didn't need to. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no applause, no speech, no ceremony. Nathaniel gave a brief nod. Luna tugged on his hand and said something to him quietly, and he leaned down to hear her, and whatever she said made him exhale in a way that loosened something across his shoulders. He had told Catherine, on the phone that Saturday, what he would need. Not a title. Not a salary figure. Though they had discussed that too. What he had said, after a long pause, was simply this. She comes with me. Wherever I'm working, whatever the schedule, Luna is there if she needs to be there. Catherine had said yes without hesitation. And so, on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks later, in the large glass conference room on the 41st floor, the room that had been the center of everything, the crisis, and the revelation, and the silence that had changed the temperature of the whole building, Luna Brooks sat at the far end of the table with a sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, drawing something that appeared to involve a very large rabbit and a city skyline. Arthur sat beside the sketchbook, propped against a water glass. Nathaniel was at the whiteboard on the far wall, walking Derek and 2 other engineers through a revised training architecture for the next iteration of ARIA. The conversation was technical and serious, and occasionally heated in the way that good engineering conversations always are, and Nathaniel moved through it with a patience that the engineers were slowly recognizing was not the same thing as slowness. Catherine stood in the doorway for a moment, not entering, not announced, and watched. She had a reputation for never standing still in doorways, for always being in motion toward the next thing, but she stood there for a moment longer than she usually stood anywhere. Luna looked up from her sketchbook and saw her. She tilted her head in that way she had the thinking tilt, and then gave a small, serious wave. Catherine lifted one hand in return. She looked at Nathaniel at the whiteboard. He had not noticed her yet. He was mid-sentence, pointing to a matrix he had drawn, and there was something in the way he was standing, the ease of it, the absence of apology, that was different from the man she had first really seen in that maintenance corridor at midnight, though she understood now that the difference was not in him. It had always been there. She simply hadn't been looking. She turned and walked back to her office. The hallway was quiet. The city moved below the windows in its perpetual, indifferent way. 41 floors down. She sat at her desk and opened the acquisition integration report that was waiting for her review. And she worked with the focused, precise attention that had always been her best quality, but this time, without quite being aware of it, she worked slightly more slowly than usual, taking a little longer to consider each conclusion, looking past the obvious answer to see what else might be there. It was a small change, but it was a real one, and Luna, in the conference room down the hall, had finished her drawing. She held it up to examine it. A tall woman in a dark jacket, standing next to a man at a whiteboard, and between them a small girl with a rabbit. The sky outside the window in the drawing was orange and pink, the way it gets over the Hudson at the end of the day when the light is going, and everything below it looks, for just a moment, like it might be worth saving. She set the drawing down and picked up a green pencil. There was still a lot to add,